But while people are joining, let's introduce ourselves. So my name is James Morehead. I'm Poet Laureate of Dublin, California. I'm the author of Portraits of Red and Gray. Love that cover. And the author of Canvas. And I loved reading Morgan's book, so I'll hand over to Morgan, Barefoot Running.
Hi, everybody. I'm a poet living in Colorado, and I am the author of Barefoot Running, as James said. It's a poetry book about our connection with nature and the healing power of nature. My work has been published all over the world at this point in literary magazines and journals, and I am so happy to be here with you guys today.
Very excited to talk about it. We both had wonderful experiences, and we've also had many, many, many rejections. So we felt all the feels that everyone who's joining has felt at some time. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of topics that we've thought about ahead of time. We'll read a couple things along the way. But why don't we start by how you get started? You know, what are the prompts, memories? How do you battle writer's block? So maybe Morgan, why don't you get us started? What do you do to get started when you got that terrifying empty space to fill in?
The best way for me to fill that empty space with my creativity is to read other poets, other poetry. It can give you ideas for voice, but also something that I love is using one of their poems as an inspiration, and you kind of like call and response with that poem. Like, for instance, I know Sylvia Plath has a really famous poem. It's one of the last pieces she ever wrote. And I wanted to follow up on that and be like, no, like I don't want that to be the end of your story. And so I wrote a part 2. And Ocean Vuong has an amazing poem. It's one of my favorites, called Someday I'll Love Ocean Vuong. And I wrote a follow-up to that because it inspired me, because the poem feels like it's about making peace with your past and like really making peace with who you are as a person. And I wanted to speak to that topic in a different kind of way, in my own personal way. So reading poetry can really jumpstart you.
That's so true. And I was fortunate to see Billy Collins perform in San Francisco recently. And he mentioned that you should read poets that you're jealous of, that you read their poetry and you're just yearning to be able to write as well as they can. And it's not like you're trying to imitate them, although painters, when they're learning the skill of painting, because all of these things are skills that are not innately there, you have to learn them. Imitation and copying famous works is one of the ways in which painters learn the skills. So I love A.E. Stallings and the way she's able to incorporate rhyme and formal structures into her poetry so elegantly. It challenged me to try to do that a little bit myself, even though it's not the place I go to naturally. And Billy Collins said, read people you're jealous of, and then you'll find your voice along the way. It is important that you find your own voice along the way, but getting there doesn't mean you'll ignore every other influence. You'll pay attention to those as well. In terms of writer's block, actually, before we get to writer's block, I'm going to tee up another idea for you. Is poems, and I think poetry uniquely doesn't have to be big, complex Game of Thrones ideas and plots. It's the opposite of that, and it can start from very, very simple things. So most of this is going to be a discussion, but Morgan and I are going to sprinkle in a few things here and there. So I will read one short poem from my new book that started with a really, really, really simple observation. And I think that's important to keep in your mind. Poetry can start with very simple things. So I'm going to read a short poem, Lost and Found, from my new book, Portraits of Red and Gray. So there you go. All right, Lost and Found. I nudge my reading glasses, appropriate. I nudge my reading glasses down, watching you rummage through drawers. My glasses, where did I leave my glasses? You repeat to yourself, hoping for an answer. I quietly observe this well-scripted, tightly performed scene on the family room stage as your fingers fumble until in exasperation you set down your book and walk away. These things we lose track of, a puzzle piece clinging to a sweaty forearm, an unpaid bill, the anniversary card bought last week, a set of rings all tucked away too safely. I worry most of all about the pages ripped from a daily calendar on my desk then crumpled and thrown away one day closer to a final tear. Perhaps next time I should offer you my reading glasses, then lie back, eyes closed, and dream of all the things I've lost or forgotten until in the quiet of night, I find what I was looking for. So that poem literally started with me sitting on my couch, and my wife was going, where the heck did I put my reading glasses? Just a tiny little thing. And I thought about it, and the poem had to be more than just that. And I thought about, well, all these things you lose track of. And then it started to become a poem. But poems can start from very simple things. And Morgan, I'm sure you have examples of that too, where something that is so simple and personal became something more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a poem starts for me as this still, small feeling in my chest. It's a simple emotion. It's something that doesn't quite feel right. And then I write the poem as a way to get it out of my body and try to figure out what it's telling me. Like, it has its own story. I just have to listen to it. There's a Robert Frost quote that I love that says, "A poem begins as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a love sickness. It is never a thought to begin with. It is at its best when it's a tantalizing vagueness. And then, through a poem, it finds its thought, and then the thought finds the words." So
Love that. A great quote. Yeah.
Wonderful. So I have a piece to read that kind of marries these two ideas about a poem starting as a small emotion, and then also a poem being an echo of a poem that you admire. So this is my poem after Ocean Vuong. It's called "Someday I'll Love Morgan Liphart." And this is the first time I'm ever reading it. So you guys—
Oh, exciting. I'm excited to hear this. Cool. Yeah.
Okay. Morgan, are you locked? Your body is a long door. Even you don't know where it goes. Morgan, are you afraid? You're a chunk of quartz, of granite. You may sink in this river, but the current will still take you home. Morgan, your name is just the crunch of a dozen dead roses until your mother calls it. I hope she never stops calling it. Remember, those arms are just arms until they reach for something greater. Morgan, are you listening? The sound of crying is just people trying to let go. Morgan, Morgan, the most necessary parts of your body are your palms on your belly, opening in forgiveness. Someday I'll love Morgan Liphart. Someday this name, this body, will mean more than just a plot of bare earth where beautiful things could grow.
Snap, snap, clap, clap. Beautiful. Beautiful. I'm excited about that. I didn't realize you were going to be something brand new. That's so cool. Awesome. Well, I think another thing that we've all experienced at some point is writer's block, and Morgan's shared a few things. I'd just like to share one more, which is, if you're really stuck, just go somewhere you haven't been before. Go to a museum, go for a walk, or in my case, an extreme example, I could feel writer's block coming. It hadn't quite arrived, but I could sense it, almost like I could see the well was starting to get near the bottom. And so I love ghost towns. So I did this 6-hour each way road trip to a ghost town in California, up in the mountains, a beautiful drive. So it was not a boring 12-hour round trip. And then the ghost town was spectacular. And I had a feeling I would get something out of it. And I did. And that poem got placed, Ghosts of Bodie, California. And that chance, the long drive, I knew would free up my head, and then seeing something as spectacular as what I saw, I just knew I'd find something there, and I did. That's not always going to happen, but I think that just breaking up your routine. I asked the musician St. Vincent. I had a chance to ask her a question at an event, and she said, "What happens when you have writer's block?" Well, just go somewhere you haven't been before, is what she does. So I think it really does. It can really help. It just gives your brain something else to chew on.
Yeah, change scenery. Mixes up thoughts. Love it.
Cool. All right. So another area of discussion is poetic forms. What form does a poem take? So Morgan, why don't you start there and think about what's your process for discovering the form of your poem?
Yeah, I am mostly a free-form poet. I learned in college all the different forms, and free form is just what works for me because I don't want to be limited on the page. I felt like restricted and in a box when I wasn't doing free form, but there are a stunning amount of forms that you can choose for your poem, and I think researching and learning all of them and then picking your favorites is probably the best way for you to start out, so you know your options and can find out kind of what works for you. But there are just so many different options. Let's see, there's free form, which I discussed. There's a prose poem, which I know you have an example of, which is more of a paragraph on a page, and it looks like a piece of fiction, but it's much shorter, and you have to have very crafted language in order to turn a prose poem into an actual, poem. There's also special formatting where it's winding across the page, you're making a shape. There's classic quatrains with A, B, rhyming stanzas. And I know we'll get into rhyming in a minute. That's a whole can of worms. Concrete poems, there's just so many forms to choose from.
Yeah, and I think that I do a podcast, by the way, as well, which folks might enjoy, the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast. And I've had a chance to interview a whole series of amazing poets, including Morgan. Terrific interview with Morgan is out there. You can hear more of her work. And I interviewed A.E. Stallings, who's a wonderful poet who she is into rhyming and structured forms in a way that I, like Morgan, I'm more free verse person with a little bit of structure here and there. And for her, she starts with the form and then does the poem and feels like it removes a decision. It's totally the opposite of how I work. I write images without any thought of how they're formed, and then the form of the poem emerges. So two thoughts about that. The first thought is I've had poems completely change their form. So I had a poem about a trip to Normandy years ago that's in my book that was originally written as a very strict, same number of syllables per line, rhyming scheme, extremely structured. It just didn't work. It came off sounding too sing-song. It came off sounding too forced. But I love the underlying story I was trying to tell, idea I was trying to convey. And then my younger daughter said, hey, you've got this other poem that uses this screenplay format. Maybe try it with that. And I rewrote it completely, and it's kind of a prose poem. I'll hold it up. It's structured like, let me make sure I'm looking at it. Yeah, Normandy in 19th. It's structured like a screenplay. Inside that, there's still little rhymes here and there. There's still little hints of what it was before, but now it works. Now the form of the poem matched what I was trying to say. So form is very intentional. It matters. And actually, another Billy Collins quote, he said, prose is about filling the page with words. Poems is about the page is silent and you're displacing the silence with words. And I just love that image. So everything with poem, the way it looks, the way the words are placed, the displacement of that silence, everything is intentional, which is what makes poetry so awesome. Every word, every space is intentional. Maybe talk about that, Morgan, how you kind of go through that journey of images, ideas, and then you visualize it on the page.
Yeah, every word has to earn its place in a poem. If you don't feel like it's doing work, then you have to cut it. And that's where you get this blank, beautiful space to play with. And we've been reciting some poems, and when you have a poetry book or you publish a poem, you don't get to necessarily recite that to the reader. And so the blank space gets to do that job for you of pausing, of putting emphasis on things. For instance, if there's a line, if you guys could see, there's blank space here, and that gives this last word more weight and lets you pause before going on to the next stanza. And that's how you effectively use blank spaces when you don't have the chance to actually spoon feed the audience the way you want the poem to sound and feel. So spacing and formatting, very intentional. And my poetry professor in college, Professor Stein, recommended trying at least 2 or 3 different forms for a poem before you decide it's done. Just give it a shot. Make it into the shape of a bird or something. If it's really long, try cutting it up and making it very, very short stanzas with lots of blank space. Just see kind of what the poem wants to do and what's more effective. Just give it a try. Low stakes, just trying it out. So that is definitely an exercise that can take your poetry to the next level.
You know, another technique that was recommended by a poet that I work with is to give your poem to somebody who hasn't read it before and have them read it out loud without reading it once. So they're reading it cold, and then see where they get tripped up. You don't want poetry to be so instructive that it's linear and locked into one thing. On the other hand, you don't want the user or the reader to be confused and stumbling when there's something intentionally you want them to get. And that might mean you need a little bit of punctuation added. You might need to do some enjambment. You might need to do some indents. There might be things you need to do to help the reader navigate the poem while still leaving it open to many different ways of interpretation. And then, another example of a concrete poem, which is not something I've done a couple of them, but it's not something I do too much, is in Portraits of Red and Gray. I had this, which is mainly about a trip I took to the Soviet Union in 1983. I had this little circus poem. It was this slight little thing, pretty short. And I decided to visualize it as a spiral because the other forms just weren't working. But as soon as I did that, it really came to life. And it was still this short little poem that the visual of it was as much about the poem as just the words.
Yeah, the visual can create an extra layer of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Before a reader even looks at it, they have a feeling about it. Or before a reader even reads it, they have a feeling about it on the page. Like I have a poem in my book, Barefoot Running, that is the shape of a bird. And that does a lot of work for me, bringing the nature theme in, getting you to think about the shape of a bird flying in the sky and its wings out before you even read the poem that's named Starling, that's about a bird coming out of a nest. And in that brief moment, right when they leave and jump into the air, you're not sure if they're falling or flying. And then at the end of the poem, she flew instead of fell. So just the form does a lot of work for you.
Just one more example of that from my first book, Canvas, is I had 2 poems that weren't quite working, and I threw them out and took phrases from them and glued them together and created a new thing. And I heard a Tibetan singing bell somewhere, and I thought, well, that's a cool sound and image. So I wanted it to be really zen-y. So it needed to look zen-y. So when I decided it needed to be visualized like this, then I had this interesting challenge of reworking the words to fit into this structure that I thought was visually so striking. And that was really, really fun. And still have it be a poem, because another poet I talked to said you have to be careful that the form doesn't overwhelm the poem, whether that's a very constrained form like a sestina or a sonnet. If the reader is trying to untangle what form is this, like it's some sort of word puzzle, then the form has overwhelmed the poetry, and you have to be really cautious about that. In fact, ideally, the same poet said, really good use of form is that you don't even notice there's a form there, except for concrete, which is very visual, but you don't notice the form until a second or third reading. And then you go, oh, that's interesting. Kind of like Morgan said, just visually seeing the poem is one experience, and then you read it and you get a second. That kind of leads into rhyming. So why don't you start with that, Morgan, since both of us are a little similar on this topic, but what are your thoughts about rhyming and really structured forms?
I think with rhyming, especially in those classically formatted poems, like that A-B structure I mentioned previous, it can overwhelm the poem. I feel like it's so hard to do that. It's almost more difficult to pull it off. And it feels like it should be easier because you've got the form in front of you. All you have to do is like fill in the blank. But it's so difficult to pull off because you have to find a way to add the element of surprise and not bore the reader, to get the reader to actually be engaged and not be like, oh, I know they're going to rhyme fear with deer next. I know where this is going. Like, you have to really have, I think, the freshest content if you're going to use heavy-handed rhyming and use those more classic structures. Like, you've just got to wow somebody with your content. And rhyming specifically, I don't do a lot of rhyming. It's kind of a little bit, becoming a little bit less popular in modern poetry. I think the free-form unrhyming structure is becoming kind of the mainstream thing in the last several, probably decades. But a cool thing that you can play with in a poem is internal rhyme, or like slanted rhyme, or just like playing with language and the way it feels in your mouth. Like, I do have an example, and several examples in Barefoot and Running, the title poem of my book. So if that's okay, I'll give that a read, and then at the end I'll kind of point out the ways I played with language. Barefoot and Running. You have a second-hand wilderness inside you, my great-grandmother warned. Braids sliding down her back and a cloud of smoke hanging from her lips. When I think of her, I smell mahogany and pressed wildflowers inside encyclopedias. I feel cool mud from kneeling over her in the ground, knowing she was right. She spit fire and tobacco. Her voice was a dusty gravel road, a dream catcher of the stars, the one chord that told me I could be unconquerable. Now my heritage is a dead language. There is no Rosetta Stone for the unrest written in my bones. My breath begs questions. I invent words, she would say. We are not stone women. No, we are soft and earthy like clay. They can't break clay. We curve, we twist, but we can never break. I can feel her in the texture of my waking dreams. When I am running, running, out of breath, running, barefoot beneath the pines, with white lightning heat and wet earth caking between my toes. Across the border of ourselves, we women like wild horses will up the street barefoot and running. So
beautiful.
a few things that I did in there. Wildflowers inside encyclopedias, right?
Mm-hmm.
It plays with language in a way that's really pleasing to the ear, but it's not technically a rhyme. It's not like, I went down to the store, it was a bore. Like, it doesn't have a cadence, but you're kind of playing with it and you're planting it in the stanzas in unexpected ways. Another one is the one chord that told me I could be unconquerable. So that k sound is making its way in this line two different ways that kind of creates this repetition that's really pleasing to the ear. Also, Rosetta Stone, unrest written in my bones. Just playing with those sounds makes poetry really interesting. It's really fun to do. And something that shows up a lot in my poetry, and even more in my fiction work, and I just can't help it, but it's several words that start with the same letter. It just shows up like my breath begs questions. And that repetition, so long as it's not obnoxious, can be really interesting, and creates this little pattern, these little patterns in your poem that's unexpected because it's not a traditional form and people aren't necessarily expecting A-B patterns or any sort of pattern.
Another thing with we had a question earlier, and I'm trying to keep an eye on those. That yes, the podcast is called the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast. Morgan A. Stallings, Olivia Gatlin. I've interviewed an incredible group of poets. More of that coming. But one of the points that A. Stallings made when I was asking her about the use of structured forms and rhyming is a risk is if you only read the classics, which are important, but be careful. If you only read classical Victorian poets and the way that they wrote and rhymed, you're not going to sound very modern if that's what you're imitating. So there are poets, modern poets, less so. It is definitely less popular now, but if there are modern poets who incorporate rhyme and structure, and you want to incorporate reading a lot of them so that your things you're learning from are somewhat modern. And then I think I'll read one very short poem from Portraits in a second here, where there's structure doesn't need to be, free verse still has structure. It's just that structure is perhaps novel, something brand new. So this short poem from Portraits of Red and Gray, this trip I took, that covers this trip I took to the Soviet Union years ago, number 15. This was actually turned into composition, was set to music for a soprano a number of years ago. Number 15 from Portraits of Red and Gray. Sipping tea in Samarkand, a nestled perch on concrete stilts. An eerie cove in shadows glow, from sunlight seeping, patterned walls, open air, a warmer breeze, so strangely whispers this hidden space. On kneeling mats and wooden slats, a simple teacup held in place. So you'll notice a couple things here. I do have some rhyme, space, place, mats, slats. Mats is not at the end of the line. I think you want to, if you're rhyming, what you don't want is da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, rhyme. Another thing A. Stalling said is you want to try to avoid, wherever possible, monosyllabic rhymes where it's single word rhyme, or the same number of syllables. Throw in some slant rhymes, ways to just break it up so that it's not obvious to the reader, and then they're playing this game of trying to guess, fill in the blank. I think that's what I heard from another poet. You don't want your poem to become a fill in the blank exercise where the reader is trying to anticipate the word. Then they've totally lost the poetry, and it's now become a puzzle. All right. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
And holding up to the camera that poem you just read, so we can get a visual sense of that format.
Oh, yes. Give me just a second here to find it. There we go. Very simple, centered, very elegant, and rare. I think I've written 2 poems in my life that were basically fell out of me and were unedited, and which feeds into our next topic. That was a rare case. I wish that happened every time. It doesn't. It happens like once in a decade. It just sort of appeared in my mind, and I couldn't write it down as fast enough. All right, so let's talk about when is a poem done, editing, revision. Morgan, why don't you start us off on this topic?
Oh, man. I am a big fan of putting a poem away and not looking at it for several weeks or several months and then coming back to it later, because it gives you a fresh eye for it, but it also, since my poems are so emotional, it gives me a fresh, emotional, clean slate. So I'm no longer in that feeling that I was in when I wrote the poem. So a few months later, I can look at it and see it for what it actually is, see it for the words on the page, instead of feeding into myself of like, oh yeah, I'm, for instance, so sad. Oh yes, this poem is so sad. Like you can really get to see the emotional resonancy of the poem and see if it works. I think a poem is done when you reread it all that time later and you have the emotional response that you were intending to create in the reader. So if it's a scary poem, I know you had a scary poem contest.
Yes.
So if that's your goal, is to create some jump scares or create this feeling of dread in your stomach. If you reread that poem fresh and you've got that feeling of dread right where you wanted to, then I think it's mostly done. I think you've done your job. I think the poem is successful. But if it doesn't give you that feeling, or you feel like it's missing something, then I think that's your cue to give it another go, revise, see where it's going wrong, see what you can tweak, try those different forms, see where you can play with empty space and use fresher words or something in the editing process. So. Yeah,
I think building on that thought, reading your poetry a lot, first of all, is critically important. When I was interviewing Olivia Gatwood, she couldn't emphasize enough that if you have no one to read your your poetry to, read in the mirror, and then just grab a family member or friend. I just find opportunities, because, you know, it's not like I'm reading War and Peace. I'm literally asking for 90 seconds of attention. It's a really, really lightweight ask. So whenever I have the opportunity, I read poetry out loud, because then you really test it. And I get a sense of when a poem is done. When I look forward to reading it, that's a good signal. And when I'm reading it, my mind isn't tweaking it on the fly. Now, there is a risk of overworking a poem, just like overworking dough, and it doesn't come out well. But for the most part, I find if I read the poem and I'm excited to read it and I just get into the joy of reading it, then that's a really good sign that the poem is edited to the point where it's not worth editing it anymore. Another way to know when it's done, or to make it done, is just to submit it somewhere. And then a version of your poem is out there and you kind of forced it. I think that some other things is feedback super important. So I think we should both talk about this one. So I'm part of a critique group, and I actually have a poetry coach, believe it or not. I hired a good friend of my older daughter's who is a USC theater grad and also competes in poetry competitions. He's a starving artist, so I'm happy to help him out. And every month or so, we meet and I give him a couple poems and he critiques them. And he's very, very actively feedback. He directs a radical candor type of feedback. It's awesome. And I'm part of a critique group too. The one thing I will say about critique, you have to be a little cautious not to allow yourself to be pulled in any direction that the feedback takes you, because sometimes you're going to disagree with the feedback. That's okay. But I think it's really hard to write really, really good poetry consistently without some kind of feedback loop, whether that's a family member you really trust or a critique group or a combination. So how does feedback and editing play a role in your work?
I have a love-hate relationship with feedback. Because as an artist, you desperately need it. But for me, the danger is it takes your confidence away. Mm-hmm. Like, oh no, it's not that great, or oh no, or a bad thing is someone could say something that you really take to heart, and so you're every time, even if the poem gets published, you're thinking of that comment. I had an ex-boyfriend say something not so great about a piece that I was working on, and I was like, darn it, I was so excited about it. And now I just can't stop thinking about that boring comment. Oh, it's boring. Just oh no, it sucked the enthusiasm out. So there is helpful feedback and there's not so helpful feedback. Definitely it's needed to see if a poem is successful. It's needed in order to get fresh ideas about your work. But I think you should stick to your guns if you fiercely believe in something.
Yeah.
So if somebody in a writing group, for instance, takes away a word or says this word is not very effective, but you think that's your favorite word, and it gets you out of bed in the morning being so excited to be creating around this beautiful word in your poem, then keep the word. You've got to stick to your vision, because in the end, a poem is successful if you love it, if you're proud of it. That is the measure of success of a piece of art as an artist, not whether everybody in your writing circle or everybody in the world loves it. So stick to your vision. I do have a story in college about a writing group that I was part of, and somebody super great writer gave me such great feedback, but he really didn't like this piece that I wrote, and he kind of rejumbled it and thought it should go a different direction. And I was just I'll edit it, but first I'm just going to submit it and see what happens. That putting the pen down, just submitting it, putting it out there moment. And it was my first poem that was ever published. And I was see, it was a really big lesson early in my writing career of sometimes these things are just really subjective.
Yes.
You just don't know. There's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. His feedback wasn't wrong or bad. My poem wasn't wrong or bad. It's just two beautiful ways of looking at something. And you get to pick. You get to pick which beautiful way you want to look at the world through this piece of art.
Yeah, and I think that the key piece of feedback you should not listen to is whether or not your poem was accepted for publication. A rejection is feedback you should pay no attention to because the rejection rate's like 98%. So if you listen to feedback from whether or not it got published, you'll be doubting everything you do. That's one thing. The other thing is, in the critique group I'm part of, the rule we follow religiously is 2/3 positive feedback, 1/3 critical, actionable feedback. So if you're going to give feedback, it has to be something that the poet can do something with. It can't be, here's an extreme example. No one in our group would say this, but I just need you to write better. You know, that's not feedback. No one in our group would say that, but that's the kind of thing, you can't do anything with that. Now, actual feedback is, you know, I read this and I was a little confused when I got to this part. I wasn't quite sure what you're trying to say. All right, that's useful. That's useful. It may be something that you've intended. It may be something that is only applied to that reader. But yes, you have to be careful with feedback. The other little thing I'll sprinkle in, again, from the A. Stallings, when I interviewed her, now she doesn't do this all the time, but she said she knows when a poem is done, she takes whatever she's written and then chops off the last 2 lines. Now, of course, she doesn't do it all the time. However, I have done that more than once, where there's a point of overwriting the ending, and it's better to leave poetry with a little bit of openness. So I've done things where I couldn't get the ending right, and then I realized I do have the ending right. It's 2 lines earlier or 3 lines earlier, and I just chop off the bottom. And poof, I was just trying to wrap it up too neatly, and that's not what poetry does. So that is a useful exercise. Another thing that can be very useful, and I think, Morgan, you mentioned this before, if you're really struggling with a poem, make a copy of it, or even start from scratch, write a parallel thing. So you've still got the original, and then do another version and just read both of them, see which one is more fun, or which one do you want to read more, is usually a good test. All right, when is the poem done? I think we've talked about that. We've talked about feedback. Reciting what you've written. All right. If we won't be able to see you, maybe you can wave. Raise your hand if reciting what you've written just terrifies you. You know, not in front of the mirror, maybe that terrifies you too, but in front of family or public.
Or let us know in the comments.
Yeah, let us know in the comments. You know, is this something that you absolutely get fearful of reciting your poem in front of friends, family, and public? Certainly me, especially a year ago. Yeah, it's still scary. So Morgan, how do you approach that challenge of reciting your poetry? How's that different?
Oh gosh, reciting your poetry live in front of people is like this big scary cliff, and I just push myself off of it. There's a quote that says, "Feel the fear and do it anyways." Do it anyways. Be like, I'm scared, but I'm still going to go to this open mic. And I'm going to shake while I read my poem, but I'm going to do it. And I'm going to be proud of myself afterwards. And then the next time I go to read at that open mic, I'll shake just a little bit less. And then the next time a little bit less until I get the hang of it. So I really believe in just going and actually doing it, actually reading your work. And that's the way that you get over those nerves. And that's the way you get better too, because through experience, you can learn how to read the audience and see what's going on. Do they like this? Do they get bored at some point? It's really, really helpful to be able to hone your reading style.
And I think that there are 2 versions. Olivia Gatwood, who's a wonderful performance poet, so I certainly recommend you seek out her on YouTube, her poem "Girl" after Ada Limon. Wonderful poem, period. But her performance is just spectacular. She's a really good. She was poetry slam competer, and then she became more traditional poet, and just her performance is wonderful. So something you can really learn from her. And so I think watching really good performance poets is good. But she was, in her interview, she said she was very introverted. It was not natural to her to perform her poetry. It's a skill you learn. So if you don't feel confident performing your poetry, that's a starting point for everybody. It's a skill you learn. And when I was, I hired this poetry coach I spoke of initially to teach me how to perform my poetry, because I could tell it was just awful. And I will read, I wasn't going to read it, but I think I'll read an example of this that I think pulls out a couple points, and it's just a poem that I love to perform. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. I think it conveys a universal thing, but it also, there's a specific insight that I got from my poetry coach that this really brought out. So this is called Crush. Teen week at Foxwood Inn. I'm 15, scrawny, bookwormed and shy. She arrives so tall, her rich brown curls, waving a smile, dazzling and confident. The crush envelops me, its weight taking my breath away. As she turns the corner, there is no time to say hi, and I fear being caught staring too long. Each morning after breakfast, I peek over my paperback, waiting for her to pass by. And if her eyes catch mine, I shrink and blush, my heart crushed and racing. Later, by the dock, the jocks show off their running, shirtless, headlong dives, while I sit silently on a fading Muskoka chair, tucking my book under a towel, avoiding splashes. When the last night comes, her name a mystery still, with Stairway to Heaven's sorrowful intro begun, I crush fear, walking towards her, extending my hand, offering a dance. She looks me in the eye and quietly nods, no, and takes the dance floor with one of the diving boys. I walk into darkness across dew-damp grass down to the end of the dock, sitting, legs swinging, toes caressing the still cool lake, Robert Plant echoing in the distance. Between chords, I hear footsteps. She's there, her hand on my shoulder, a tear sliding down my cheek. I like you, James, but just as a friend, sitting down beside me as the song ends. I feel the crush as my imagined first kiss drifts away with the ripples beneath my feet, but in time smile, eyes closed and dry, replaying her saying my name. Crush. All right, now that poem, when I first read it for my poetry coach, it was a train wreck. It was terrible. I was just, and he had this critical insight that is so valuable. He first asked me, where's the turn? And I thought about it, and I go, oh, it's when she turns me down for the dance. And then he made this insight that stuck with me since then. The reader, and especially the listener, has no idea whether or not she's going to say yes to the dance. So you can plant whatever seed you want. So when I read it, I'm intentionally setting it up like maybe she said yes, because the reader doesn't know. And I used to be telegraphing that she was going to say no too soon. And that was something that was a skill I had to learn. It was not something I did intuitively because I knew the poem so well. I forgot that the reader and the listener doesn't know the poem. They're just hearing or reading it for the first time. So I think that was the takeaway. The other thing he recommended was marking up the poem with extra punctuation that helps you remember where you want to do intentional pauses and things. And actually doing that is really valuable. So Morgan, what's kind of how do you prepare for a reading of a poem?
Yeah, so I do exactly that. I mark up the page to make sure I emphasize the words or create more of a pause and really soak that moment in. So I have a special copy of this book that is just my reading book because it has all of my little markings in there. And it also helps to have handwritten at the end of each poem where I've read it. So I know you and I do a lot of open mics, especially a lot of virtual open mics. And so I don't want to read the same poem in the same audience, like the next month. And I can barely remember what I had for breakfast this morning. I can't remember what poem I read. So I'll say, read this at such and such open mic on this date in the actual book. So it's all in one place. And, I had a thought about earlier our discussion on it being scary, because let's validate that it is kind of scary to read in front of people. Something that might be helpful is to go slow and first read in front of someone that you trust, like your mother. She's supposed to love you unconditionally, so even if you crash and burn, she'll still clap. So that might be something that can help ease you into it. Find one safe audience member to read. Once you get more comfortable there, grab your whole family or grab some neighbors, grab some friends, and work your way up to that your spotlight on the stage, instead of maybe throwing yourself off the cliff like I did to myself. You don't have to do that to yourself.
Yeah, and I think that the best way to get better, it's an example of something, the best way to get better at reciting poetry is to recite poetry, engage the audience. There's really no shortcut to that. Is the more you do it, the better you get. And getting feedback from people. I got feedback from some good friends of mine that said, you know, you're rushing the beginning of your poems, and I have to run to catch up. And I'm like, ooh. So I'll put right down in my book, slow down. That happens in a lot of things. Nerves speed you up, and then you settle back down. So it's a challenge to settle down right at the beginning. Another friend I spoke to memorizes the first stanza or two, so their mind is caught up on the remembering, and it just naturally slows them down and gets them focused on that. So there are a lot of tricks. But if you feel nervous, another thing, my parents are both retired professional musicians. My mom said the day you're not nervous before a performance is the day you should retire. So about 15 minutes before this started, I was texting Morgan to say, butterflies are arriving because of this. Yes, yeah. It's natural. It is totally natural. Yeah. So let's move on to, you know, the core of what this is all about. We said this writing, publisher, writing poetry. So submitting your poetry and getting it published in a variety of ways. Like, why don't you, Morgan, start us up again and how to approach it? I think you have a ton of awesome advice on this.
Yeah. Oh gosh, this is such a big topic. But I think the best thing is to just submit your poem. And you can always revise it later. You can always change the title later, but just get it out there into the world. If you think it might be ready, submit it. You have nothing to lose. Send it to a few publishers. And when you send a poem out into the world, I would expect for you to send it out many, many, many times. That is very, very typical. It is truly, truly a numbers game because the acceptance rate is so low. Some journals have a 0.02% acceptance rate. Like, that's a really sick. And even if you have amazing work, even if they love your poem, they still might not be able to accept it because of the spacing in it, or because of the theme of it, or because they have another poem that's very similar, or it's just not the right thing for this issue. It's not a spring poem and they want to put it in the spring issue or something like that. You just don't have control over all of that. So you just have to submit it and have good faith that in a year or two, sometimes maybe even 5 years, sometimes maybe even a decade, someone will love it. Someone somewhere will be like, we have to have this poem for our journal. It will happen. You just have to be tenacious and keep going. I think I told a story on our last class that a poem took years, like years, to get picked up. And I was tenacious and I was like, no, this is still good. Even though I've been submitting it for 5 years now, I'm still going to keep going. And it was placed. And you just have to believe in your work enough. And it's so hard once you get that rejection to keep going. But dust yourself off. Keep submitting it. It will pay off.
You just, it's so much of it comes down to timing. There's an element of luck to it. There's an element of what you control. What you can control is where you submit it to. What you can control is the quality of your submissions. What you can't control is who else happens to be submitting at that point. As Morgan said, there could be, maybe for whatever reason, a whole bunch of people submitted about in a similar type of style or topic, and the publication wants a diversity of styles and themes, and they've already got a bunch of that, and it has nothing to do with the quality of work. In fact, I think it rarely has anything to do with the quality of your work. It has to do with things beyond your control. That's why it's still no fun getting a rejection. It is no fun getting a rejection. However, it is definitely, I find it much less effective than it did early on, because I realized that it doesn't really reflect on the quality of the work. I've had a poem that was rejected that was later turned into a 10-minute piece of music for baritone and piano, and the composer just fell in love with it. And then that same poem was picked up by Beyond Words magazine 6 months later. If I had paid any attention to the first rejection and just said, oh, this is no good. What a mistake. I wouldn't have had that set to music and performed at the Presidio in San Francisco. I wouldn't have had it placed in Beyond Words. It was the same poem. It fit the lock, fit the key fit the lock better for those other opportunities. So just keep at it. It's a numbers game. A tactical thing that Morgan taught me that's been, I'm convinced got placed, a poem placed, was how you title your poem. So before I spoil your punchline there, talk to me about what you taught me about titling poems.
Yeah, so the title is one of the most important things about a poem. Because if you think about it, a literary journal has a table of contents, and someone will flip to your poem or pass it by in the table of contents based on the title. If the title grabs them, they're going to flip to page 43 and read it. And also when an editor is looking at whether to publish your piece or not, that's the first thing that they see. And they're considering that too. They want to get clicks if it's an online journal. They want to get people excited about the journal if it's a print journal. And so the title just has to grab you. It's the first hook. So for me, I see a lot of work, and I can fall into this trap too, where a title will be something descriptive about the poem. Like a poem about flowers will be titled Flowers or Tiger Lilies or something like that. And I think that is doing a disservice to your poem because that doesn't grab you. That doesn't really pull you in. But if it's a poem about flowers, and this is a real example that I saw somewhere a month ago, and I still remember the title because it grabbed me that much. Your title could be Biting the Heads Off of All the Marigolds in Spring. I still remember that. It was something like that. And it's just, it sticks with you because it's such a visual title and it's so unusual. So just think of your title as a hook instead of a description, and that will take you so much farther.
And I was not good at this. I wasn't even paying attention to this really. Morgan made this comment, and then I re-looked at a bunch of poems and pulled some of them down and replaced them. And a great example that got placed in Prometheus Dreaming, which is a cool online journal. I had a poem that was called Stage Fright, very functional title. It was reflective of the poem. The poem didn't change, but I changed the title to That Time I Was Left for Dead Downstage. Same exact poem. Now, which would you rather read? The one that says Stage Fright or the one that says That Time I Was Left for Dead Downstage? You know, and the way you can test it is if you have two titles you're not sure, just ask friends and family, which of these two poems would you want to read? And just give the title and see which one. That's what editors do in newspapers. The editor, when there's a newspaper story, the writer, the reporter doesn't write the headline. Experts in headlines, the editors write the headlines, which a lot of people don't realize. So that's important. I'm noticing in the questionnaire, what journals do you recommend? So I think we both give answers to this. I use a variety of techniques. You know, certainly looking through Submittable can be one approach. I think another approach I've used more recently is I look at poetry books that I really respect, and I see where that poet has had their poetry placed because they've gotten to another level. And so I think of it as also partially kind of like university applications. You know, back in the day, I would do, there's your reach schools like the New Yorker or the Parish Review. If you're only submitting your poetry there, and they wouldn't allow you to submit that much per year, you know, you're taking your chance from 1% to 0.0001%. So you want to have a spread of things, and some publications accept more, like Wingless Dreamer. Some accept very little because of the volume of things they get, like the Parish Review and the New Yorker, and there's things in between. I think so. Look at publications that from writers you respect. Also look at the types of things that they accept. And Morgan, you had great advice about how the cover letter, once you've chosen a publication, share what you've learned about how you actually position your poem in addition to the title, the cover letter.
Well, a cover letter should have your bio. It should have something that makes you stand out to them. I'm not sure exactly what you're.
Oh, you would say that you would actually you would actually make a reference to the editor or a person or something that showed that you had taken a look at them. right? That was the advice you gave. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks. There's so many things to talk about with cover letters.
Yeah.
It's really important. You can live or die by your cover letter, truly. But I always take the time to address the cover letter to the particular poetry editor. So I go on the website for the literary journal, I look up the editor or editors, and I address it to them. Because so many people have the just same cover letter for each journal. And because it's so time consuming to create all these different cover letters and send them out to like 200 journals a year. But just taking that extra time, those extra minutes, the extra step to address it to the right editor, maybe customize it for the journal. If it's a Midwest journal, I'll say, I'm from the Midwest. So they know that you took the time to craft the cover letter for them. And it's also likely that you took the time to craft the poetry package for them. So they might read your poetry package with a little bit more interest.
I'm just going to do a couple extra thoughts, and I want to make sure I leave time for Morgan to talk about a cool new service that she's going to offer. But another thing to do is just like if you were applying for a job, make sure that there's not a showstopper requirement. So if the publication, for example, is specifically for LGBTQ plus authors, and that's not where you fit in, then you don't want that to be a showstopper. Or if it's a publication specific for students of a particular university, submittable is used for all sorts of things. So just do a sanity check to make sure that there won't be some disqualifying thing about your submission before they even get to the poem. So with that, Morgan, why don't you take kind of 30 seconds to talk about this cool new service that you're going to be launching down the road.
Yes. So through these classes that we've done together, I realized that I have a real passion for teaching people how to take their poetry from something that they love to something that they share with the world through being able to publish it in all these journals and magazines. So many people have this as their life dream, to be a writer. And maybe part of my dream is to help you accomplish that. So I'm going to start filming my own little masterclass on poetry writing. And it takes you through the world of poetry, giving some context about that, how to write a poem like we've been talking today, how to publish a poem. I'm going to have writing exercises. I'm going to have Excel spreadsheet templates for you to use for your publishing, because that helps you keep track of like what poems you've sent where. I'm going to have a list of all the poetry journals that I use, and I've curated this list over so many years. So it has a lot of information on it. So I've got my curriculum written, and I just need to sit down and actually film it. So if that sounds like something you might be interested in, feel free to give me a follow here on Instagram. And I'm going to push out information through my Instagram about it, but you can also direct message me on Instagram if you want to get on the mailing list, and I'll add your email when it finally launches. I'm so excited.
Very cool. Very excited about that, Morgan. And yes, Morgan referred to, we did another Instagram Live that is available as a podcast episode and also on YouTube. This will also go out on YouTube. The other thing is through Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, once a month or so, I have a compiled episode of submitted poetry. And the thing that I'm doing that I think is kind of cool and unique is I'm not just publishing the poems on the website, which a lot of people do. I'm having the poets perform their poems and so that they can be part of a podcast episode. So the next one of those comes out next week. There's roughly one a month. The best of the contributions get performed by the poets, pulled together into an episode. So I don't know if there's any other podcasts that do that, quite frankly, off submission. So if you're interested in that, you go to viewlesswings.com, and there's a submission button, or we're on Instagram now, so link in bio. You can go check that out. With that, mandatory that Morgan and I hold up our books. Please consider purchasing our books, Ports Running Gang, Canvas, and
Barefoot Running.
All available in all the usual places. It's been we've had a ton of people just stay the entire time. That's super exciting. If you know people that missed it, I'm going to go reshare this on YouTube as well as on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast. Morgan, it's always awesome talking to you. I hope for folks that were on that I see lots of hearts and other things that you enjoyed and learned something today. And Morgan, any closing thoughts?
Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is truly the highlight of my week, probably the highlight of my month. So you make this possible by being willing to learn and have this discussion with us. So I appreciate you.
Absolutely. Do that too. Thank you so much for joining us today.
James, thank you.
Bye.